are even less likely. Women in rural areas are even less likely than kind of women in urban areas to have access to a private pension. Women often report that they can't afford one, their employer doesn't offer one. And again, in sectors, like hospitality and retail, those really kind of female dominated sectors, coverage is particularly low in those kind of sectors. So the implications of this male breadwinner model then are that many women don't have an independent pension of their own. Rather, they derive rights through their relationship with a partner under what's called the qualified adult system. So we know that in theory, while this is gender neutral, in fact, over 90% of qualified adults are women. So, I mean, for the Women's Council, derived rights should have no place in our pension system. We will be aware from our work with older women that many older women in Ireland, they don't feel they can apply for the state non-contributory pension because it involves a test of household assets which they may have no control over or access to. And there's also a fear often that it can jeopardize their husband's income or their husband's pension. So women end up then kind of remaining in this state of economic dependence. And one of the other key issues then in the pension system is that it doesn't value care. So we've seen huge increases in women's labour market participation in recent decades. But at the same time, women continue to provide the vast majority of unpaid care. And, women's care patterns, it doesn't end when children are raised. And we know that older women, for example, are 5 times more likely than men to leave work to care for a family member. So it's this pattern of care, it kind of continues throughout women's life cycle. And so, on the one hand, women's care responsibilities mean that they are sometimes out of the labour market, so they're not in a position to make pension contributions. But these gaps in employment, they also have a knock-on effect because women typically return to low-paid, part-time or insecure work. And they also miss out on promotional opportunities. And we know then that, these interruptions in paid work, they can have a really dramatic effect on earnings. For example, a 10-year break can translate into kind of 15 to 20% wage drop. And because part-time work choices tend to be kind of exercised over the same years, that women are kind of in their prime earning years, if you will, the opportunity cost then of that part-time work is high as well. And, well, there have been reforms to the pension system aimed at recognising care, and that's really positive to see those reforms. Things like the homemaker scheme, home caring periods, and total contributions approach. At the same time, the reforms don't adequately address the inequalities and the discrimination experienced by older women. And we know, for example, that when the Department of Social Protection reviewed people's eligibility for pensions under the TCA approach, only 40% of cases resulted in an increased pension payment. And it's not clear kind of how many of them maybe have resulted in a full state pension. So overall, the reforms, while elements of them are welcome, they continue to reinforce a system that prioritises labour market participation and holds it in a higher value than unpaid care. So I suppose, what kind of pension system would work for women then? So I suppose we have principles in mind that we think should underpin our pension system. And there's general principles like adequacy. Of course, you want the pension to be adequate, comprehensiveness, simplicity. They're kind of the general principles. But there are particular gender-related principles that should inform pensions policy as well. So firstly, financial autonomy and individual entitlement, should be core characteristics of our pension model. The state pension should provide women with direct pension rights rather than this system of kind of, dependency on your partner. Gender equality in pensions requires a pensions model that recognises and rewards all labour market participation and is able to facilitate kind of atypical work that women are often involved in. Really importantly, care work needs to be facilitated, respected, and rewarded in a way that enables men and women to maintain their pension contribution maintain their pension contributions during kind of key stages of care. And one of the things we often say is that care always costs. Allowing that cost to be carried by individual women in terms of like reduced income and reduced pensions, it's not cost neutral, which is the term that's often kind of used, and it's certainly not acceptable. And another piece is that while working towards broader kind of policy goals of greater gender equality in care and in the labour market, the pension system kind of must not reinforce and in fact must be capable of compensating for the disproportionate time that women have spent in periods of care, and the kind of wider gender equality that women experience in the labour market. And lastly, kind of connected to that, the Women's Council believes that the state has a particular responsibility to remedy the inequality experienced by women affected by the marriage bar. And there's kind of there's limited data available on how many women kind of are still affected by it. But one study a few years back looked at Tilda data and found that over 50,000 women were not qualifying for a full state pension because of the marriage bar. And they kind of estimated this actually probably was an under estimate as well. So again, a significant number of women still affected by the marriage bar. So I suppose, our position, the solution that we would propose comes from our years of advocacy work and research with older women. And our view is that the best model to deliver on these principles and to achieve equality for women is a universal pension, which would guarantee income adequacy in older age and would also recognise that paid work and unpaid work are equally valuable. So there's many benefits to a universal pension. Among them, it would be the best solution to addressing persistent issues with low coverage and income adequacy. It's the best way to ensure unpaid care work is recognised in the pension system. It would provide direct pension access to women and men. So, it offers the opportunity to eliminate that relationship of dependency inherent in the qualified adult concept. It would also offer kind of redress to those who have experienced the historical discrimination in the labour market and access to the social welfare system, so things like the marriage bar. But there's also administrative benefits and savings. So, it reduces bureaucracy by having only one test for kind of accessing the payment instead of the current system where you have kind of, myriad different conditions and tests and so on. So by offering a simpler system, you have a lower transaction cost. So there is savings associated with the administration of it as well. And, when we talk about care and pensions, the focus is often on how best to support women who provide care. And of course, we know that the majority are women. But I suppose at the Women's Council, our analysis, our kind of feminist analysis of care includes, obviously the perspectives of the women who provide care, but also the women who need such supports. So maintaining this kind of minimum paid contributions to access the state pension, it's a barrier to women who provide care, but it's also a barrier for women who require support or care to live independently or to be kind of sufficiently active in the labour market to be eligible for a state pension. So I'm speaking here of kind of maybe disabled women, disabled men who need support, or migrant men and women, anybody who experiences barriers to the labour market. So a universal pension works on kind of many fronts. We believe that it is achievable and can be paid for through changes to pensions tax expenditures and through broadening the tax base. It's also a key recommendation of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, who, after listening to all of the expert testimony, looking at the evidence and kind of listening to men and women all over Ireland, the Citizens' Assembly agrees that a universal pension is the best approach. So I think we all understand very well how challenging the last year has been. And it's been a challenging year for older people in particular who have cocooned at home for much of the year. And obviously for women who've seen their care responsibilities increase even further. But I suppose despite these challenges, we think it's important that women's voices are directly heard in kind of discussions on pensions. So I just kind of thought I would leave you with some of the words of some of the women who've taken part in some of the Women's Council's pension projects over the years. I don't know if people can see that picture, but what it says is Kerry for pension equality. So if there's any Kerry people here, you're well represented in the Women's Council. Okay, so I will leave it at that. Thank you. I'll just stop sharing there now. I'll hand over back to Una and Colette.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was really interesting. And I think those quotes at the end really summarize the issues and also just really paint the picture of what it's like facing into income insecurity in older age. We're going to move on to Colette Bennett. So Colette, you're absolutely welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Colette is an economic and social analyst with Social Justice Ireland, a policy think tank, I can never get that right, working to build a just society. Social Justice Ireland have been advocating for a universal state social welfare pension for a number of years now, provided on the basis of residency, which would eliminate the gendered nature of pension provision. So thank you so much, Colette. And I don't know if you have any slides to share, so fire ahead.
Do I? I certainly do. So I will try my best now to share them with you. Thank you so much. Okay, can everybody see my slides?
I can see them there.
Perfect. Okay, so following on from Sandra's piece, I'm just going to go through, I suppose, what we believe a universal state social welfare pension should actually look like. And first of all, I'd really like to thank everybody, but particularly to Una and Elaine for inviting me to speak here today. So Sandra has pretty much, as I knew she would, set out the case for making this a far more equitable, a far more feminist, a far more female-friendly system. And what we believe in Social Justice Ireland is that a universal state social welfare payment would do exactly that. So just to give, if this will work, of course, just to give a bit of the policy context in relation to it. You'll see here the at-risk of poverty rate between 2008 and 2019, and it goes from about 14.4% all the way up to the most recent data, which is 12.8%. If we look at the same data in relation to those aged 65 and older, you see that there's a slightly lower proportion of those aged 65 or more that are at risk of poverty. So it's, compared to the 12.8% for the national population, it sits at around 10.5%. In terms of the importance of the state pension, however, when we look at the at-risk of poverty rate, excluding all social transfers, we see the type of work that's being done by the welfare system. So we go from a current rate of 41.4% to just 12.8% of the general population. For those aged 65 and beyond, however, it's more than double the national population rate. So without the state pension system, older people will be in considerable difficulty, or a considerable proportion of older people would be at risk of poverty, sitting at 85.6%. So that is why the state pension is so important, and it's so important to get it right. So, when we're looking at the pension, we talk about universality as being a really important step. So when the roadmap for pensions reform came into being back in 2018, it looked at 6 strands: reforming the state pension, to be welcomed; supplementary pensions on automatic enrolment, less so; improving governance, obviously to be welcomed; measures to support the defined benefit schemes; public service pension reform, and supporting fuller working lives. And, definitely some things to like there, other things to be a little more, I suppose, skeptical or a little more analytical about. In terms of fairness, and we talk, and Sandra talked very much about the importance of fairness in the pension system, particularly when it comes to gender differentials. So making a pension system that works for everybody and that isn't dependent on your household status is really down to universality. So insofar as it's affected by the roadmap and the general pensions landscape, when the government published its green paper back in 2007, in those heady days of 2007, it stated that the objectives of the pension system were to provide an adequate basic standard of living through direct state supports, to encourage people to make supplementary pension provisions so that they'd have an adequate income in retirement, sustainability, modernisation. And to a great extent, very little has changed. The purpose of a state pension was to provide an adequate standard of living on the understanding that people would have their accommodation costs sorted by the time they retired. Now, there's going to be an interesting debate and an interesting tension between housing costs and pension costs, and where the state should put its funds, as we see more people in the private rented sector and fewer homeowners into older age. But essentially the state pension should provide that adequate standard of living. The roadmap for pension reform stated that that the pension would remain the bedrock of the system for years to come. And as I said, we will see how that plays out into the future. And there is plenty of talk in relation to achieving sustainability and reform and, other aims, including universality. So when we're going to look at that, we're going to look at it in terms of sustainability and in terms of fairness. The achievement of universality has been talked about by politicians, by the OECD, by pensions and insurance bodies, and by many organisations within our own sector, very much including ourselves. And it isn't put forward as a stated aim of the system, but, it is something that should be achieved within Ireland, and it's something that we should all strive towards. But however, there's no one definition, so it's not going to be that easy to achieve if we can't settle on what it actually means. If you think in terms of universality, if you think in common sense terms, a general definition will be, it should apply to everybody. Everybody should get it. It should affect or concern all peoples. So, you might think universal pension coverage might mean that all elderly people in this country above the state pension age will have state pension coverage. And that's a value judgment. The term we've used in Social Justice Ireland is sufficient income to live a life with dignity, that everyone should have that should be your bare minimum floor in older age. So pension systems generally were originally instituted to allow elderly to retire from the workforce without the prospect of a life in poverty. And I showed you my first slide in terms of the heavy lifting that pensions are doing. And the countries which followed the original example of Otto von Bismarck's Germany generally had the same aim. So the question is, how do we achieve universal coverage? Well, there's a number of different approaches. A number of years ago, there was a report, Universal Pension for Ireland. And the organisation that created that report described itself as the voice of insurance in Ireland. And that's fine. I mean, if that's how they want to describe themselves, we all have that within our remit ourselves in Social Justice Ireland, describe ourselves as a policy think tank advocating for a just society. But they're also essentially a lobby group representing a number of companies, many of whom sell private pensions. So unsurprisingly, they believe that the private pensions industry has a significant role to play in delivering universality. A couple of years ago, Leo Varadkar obviously spoke of the need for a new universal workplace retirement saving scheme for workers without supplementary retirement provision, which is basically the private scheme now known as auto enrolment. And indeed, that is very much the direction that we're heading. In terms of what auto enrolment looks like, it is a workplace pension scheme. So if you have to be in the workforce or in the workplace to avail of it, can it really be thought of as universal when we know, and again, Sandra's slides pointed to it, 94% of those looking after home and family are women. In terms of certain age and income thresholds, between 23 and 60, and an income threshold of about 20,000 in terms of earnings. Now, just to remember, 20,000 is the gross earnings figure that is being mooted. That is just over the poverty threshold for a one-parent, one-child family. So what would that mean in terms of real poverty rates? If you earn 20,000 and you are, basically mandatorily part of an auto enrolment scheme, what does that mean in terms of your ability to pay your day-to-day expenses pre-retirement? Are we pushing people into a situation where they live in poverty in order to have some level of an income post-retirement and into older age? And that is something that needs to be addressed, and unfortunately can't be addressed by the Commission on Pensions because auto-enrolment isn't within their remit. It's quasi-mandatory. There are opt-outs and there are breaks put into it, but there are then mandatory matching contributions from employers and possibly some level of state top-ups. But essentially, what does it mean in terms of sustainability and fairness? My own view is that if you are living potentially in poverty in order to pay for it post-retirement, it's neither sustainable nor fair. It is, however, hard to settle on definitions. Everyone has their own definition of fairness, and sustainability will mean something different depending on the context and who you talk to. When talking about sustainability of the pension system, people often mean sustainability of the state pension in the face of the changing demographics. We know, for example, that our population is growing and it's getting older. And this is generally what's meant when you hear government politicians talking about pensions, and that narrative in the media being the same as this kind of pensions time bomb. But it can also refer to, oh, sorry, have I gone completely mad? I have, sorry. But it can also refer to a situation where many elderly people don't have sufficient income to live a life with dignity. It can refer to a situation where significant resources are being directed towards a policy that's not achieving what it's supposed to achieve. A study back in 2014, which looked at silk data and was by Collins and Hughes, found that taking the median contribution of 3,300 per annum as an example, contributing to a pension for 40 years will provide an annual income in retirement of about €5,200. Combined with the state pension, that gave a replacement rate of 37.5% for a median pension contributor. Now, is that sustainable? Like, the median contributor, the person right in the very middle, is only likely to come away with a retirement income from their private pension of $5,200 a year. So what about those below that level? Which half of all people are? So what are they getting? And that's assuming that annuity rates don't drop any further than they already have. So nowadays, an individual turning 66 is looking at about 4%. That's how far they've come down. And our life expectancy and the financial conditions that drive annuity rates don't look like changing sufficiently in the near future to change that trend. So we've gone from pensions that were sold to give an annuity rate of between 12 and 14 to 4. Are private pensions providing sustainable and adequate incomes on that basis? I don't really think so. So, indeed, introducing the auto-enrolment as a means of achieving universality seems to almost be doubling down on that system that's not achieving the aim it set out to achieve. The cost of this system as presently constituted is significant, and it's been estimated that auto-enrolment would increase this cost further by about 700 to 800 million euro per annum. But what about fairness? Well, a high proportion of the benefits from pension-related tax reliefs go to the better off, and you can see that there in terms of the income deciles here. In terms of coverage rate, the highest have the highest coverage rate, with the lowest incomes earners having the lowest. They tie in with previous data from the SRI that show how those benefits were spread. And Colette and Hughes in their 2017 paper estimated that in 2014, 72% of pension reliefs accrued to individuals in the top income quintile. If auto-enrolment has been identified as the means of delivering universality and as a policy that's continuing, so we have to assume that it has, then it's falling well short of what it's aiming to do. By very definition of the proposed structure, it'll only deliver coverage to those who are in employment, so those carers will be outside the net. And even then, it'll surely only deliver cover to a proportion of those in employment. People on short-term contracts, people who are underemployed, people who are in precarious employment, they're likely to be not in no position to take up this system. There is also a perception out there that, you know, you're from everybody, like from the average man on the Clapham omnibus to ministers, that if you're getting a social welfare pension, you know, or if you're not getting a social welfare pension, it's because you don't really deserve a social welfare pension, because, you know, you haven't been paying your contributions. But again, as Sandra says, you know, there are many reasons why contributions or sufficient contributions have not been paid, particularly in the case of carers, and again, particularly on that basis in the case of women. What Social Justice Ireland proposed back in March of 2018, when we published our social welfare pension proposal, was a system that would provide universal pension for all, to provide older citizens with a guaranteed income in older age, regardless of means or employment history, to provide those older people who do not currently receive any support through the state pension system with a pension, achieving real universal coverage, and to alter the distribution of money within the pension system in a way that is fairer. How would we do it? Well, we'd alter the structure of tax reliefs. We'd change the direction away from privatised auto-enrolment. It would be based on residency. So our proposal would be that 1/40th of the total benefit for every year spent living in Ireland between the ages of 16 and the retirement age would be accrued. So after 40 years of residency, that the full pension would be available. In terms of the key characteristics, it would replace all other social welfare pension payments for people above the state pension age. It would replace the qualified adult payments. It would be paid at the rate of 243.30 a week. It would be residency based, as I said. All pensioners would move to universal pension. The qualified increases would continue for certain situations. It would gradually rise to 35% of average earnings and be benchmarked from there on. And it would include the pre-April 95 public servants with the clawback for those with significant pensions. In terms of costing, our calculations indicate that the immediate additional cost of introducing this type of a pension based on 2019 figures will be about 727 million. So not an insignificant amount, but we propose funding it by way of a reform of the current structure of tax relief for private pensions by reducing the top rate on which private pension contributions receive tax relief from the marginal rate to a standard rate of 20%. We'd also propose reducing the earnings cap from 115,000 to 72 and reducing the standard fund threshold. We'd also propose increasing the rate of employer PRSI by 0.5%. So through a combination of these measures, we think that it is sustainable. And it certainly won't be helped by diverting 700 million to a part of the system that doesn't create universality at all. Based on provisional calculations, we estimate approximately 702,000 beneficiaries would come within the system. One thing that should be noted here, though, is that in the past, government, when examining the viability of this proposal, estimated the extra cost would be about 1.175 billion, deeming it too expensive. However, we've costed it quite differently. And in fact, we've costed it about $500 million less in year one. Now, the difference there is due to the inclusion of the clawback applying to pre-95 public servants. And for future projections, we've also factored in the increasing number of people who will be qualifying for the contributory pension as time passes due to that higher workforce participation and increased social insurance cover. In terms of projected costs then, 727 million and an approximate yearly cost of auto-enrolment in comparison of 700 to 800 million. So it could be achieved for the same cost as auto-enrolment, but have a much better, much fairer impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Colette, and apologies there for the massive gaps between that and me speaking, trying to deal with technology and all of that. I'm just going to turn off the recording now so that we can go into a questions and answers section.